Good to see you again. Welcome to the program.
Glad to be with you again.
What we are facing is often described as unprecedented, a pandemic, climate catastrophe, and always lurking off center stage, nuclear annihilation. Three of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Are there any comparable historical analogs that you know of?
Well, I can add a fourth, the impending destruction of what remains of American democracy and the shift of the United States towards a deeply authoritarian, possibly proto-fascist state when the Republicans come back into office, which looks likely. So that's four horses, and that has a big effect on the world and on the other three. Remember that the Republicans are the denialist party, the party that is committed to racing to climate destruction with abandon as quickly as possible into the hands of the chief wrecker, who they now worship like a demigod. It's bad news for the United States and for the world, given US power. So there's four.
The Swedish International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance annual report just came out on the global state of democracy. It says that the United States is a country where democracy is, quote, backsliding, unquote.
Very severely. The Republican Party is openly dedicated, not even concealed, to undermining what remains of American democracy, and they're working very hard on it. There's quite an interesting article by Barton Gellman in the Current Atlantic, which runs through a lot of the details, worth reading carefully. He's a highly credible commentator of what he thinks is what he's doing, I think, is correct. The Republicans have long understood, back to Nixon, that they're fundamentally a minority party. They're not going to be able to get votes by advertising their increasingly open commitment to the welfare of the ultra rich and the corporate sector. So they've been diverting attention to other issues as much as they can, so-called cultural issues. Began with Nixon's Southern strategy. Nixon realized, as apparently LBJ had as well, that with limited democratic support for civil rights legislation, they would lose Southern Democrats, and who were openly and overtly extreme racists. The Nixon administration capitalized on that with their Southern strategy, hinting, not so subtly, that the Republicans would become the party of white supremacy. Subsequent years, they picked up other issues. I think we've talked about it. I won't run through it, but it's now the virtual definition of the party. So let's run on critical race theory, whatever that means. A cover term, as the leading spokesmen have explained, for everything that we can rally the public on. White supremacy, racism, misogyny, Christianity, abortion rights, whatever we can pick up, will mobilize people on that. Meanwhile, at the same time, the leadership, with the aid of the right-wing Federalist Society, has been developing legal, if you want to call it, means for the Republicans to ensure that as a minority party, they will nevertheless be able to control the voting apparatus and the outcome of elections, exploiting the radically undemocratic features that are built into the constitutional system and the structural advantages that Republicans will have as a party representing more scattered rural populations, more traditionally Christian white nationalist, and even with the minority of the vote using these advantages, they should be able to maintain something like almost permanent power. Actually, the permanence won't be long. If Trump comes back into office or a Trump clone in 2024, it's not very likely that the United States, and in fact the world, will be able to escape the impact of the climate destruction, environmental destruction that they are committed to accelerating. So that's it's not an attractive prospect. And it's not very clear that much can. There's a short-term Republican strategy which is working very well. That is, as has been made explicit by Mitch McConnell and others, make the country ungovernable. Same policy they played when a couple of years when Obama had control. Make the country ungovernable, meaning harm it as much as possible, blame the Democrats, come back into office, then put in motion the devices that are carefully being planned to ensure that the structures of American democracy will erode, and this organization, which is no longer a political party in any traditional sense, will be able to gain permanent power, something like it, and bring back the wrecker-in-chief who they crawl to Mar-a-Lago to go for his blessings in a display of cowardice that is almost beyond description. Well, that's what's happening before our eyes. So today, the Republicans managed to kill Biden's program to institute testing or mandates or vaccination at businesses with 500 employees or later. That's a perfect way to increase the pandemic, which is raging, harm the population, crush more hospitals with unvaccinated patients, shriek about liberty, which they don't believe in for a minute, but and make the country suffer. And then you can blame it on the Democrats. Same with everything else. The limited climate change components of the legislative proposals have been pretty much killed. Other things have been attenuated to the point where even if it passes the next one, which is unlikely, it will not do enough, certainly in the short term, to give any indication that the Democrats or the government can do anything for the population. So you can arouse the voting base on with the kinds of appeals that they have honed into devices to mislead, control, direct attention away from real issues to the so-called cultural issues that they would like to hold in the forefront as they proceed to undermine the economy, harm the population, ensure short-term profit for their masters in the corporate sector. That's what we're facing.
We all saw what happened in Washington on January 6th. Do you see the possibility of civil unrest spreading in the United States? There are multiple militias all across the country. Representative Paul Gosar of the great state of Arizona, Representative Lauren Bobart of the great state of Colorado, among others, have made threatening statements inciting violence and hatred. The internet is crawling with conspiracy theories. What must we do to prevent that?
It is very serious. In fact, I think maybe a third or so of Republicans think it may be necessary to use force to save our country, as they put it. Save our country has a clear meaning. If anyone didn't understand it, Trump twittered it out, or not Twitter, whatever he uses, a couple days ago, when he issued a call to people to mobilize to prevent the Democrats from swamping the country with criminals who are being let out of jails in other countries, so that the Democrats can pour them across the border, as is now happening, to replace white Americans, the great replacement, and to carry out destruction of America, mobilized to stop that. And that's what take away our country means. And it's being used very effectively by the proto-fascist elements, Trump being the most extreme and the most successful. What can we do about it? The only tools available, like it or not, are education and organization. There's no other way. Whether it's strong, it means trying to revive a real, authentic labor movement of the kind that has existed in the past and been in the forefront of moves towards social justice, organizing other popular movements, carrying out widespread educational efforts to combat the brutal, murderous anti-vaccine campaigns that are going on, make sure that there are serious efforts to deal with the climate crisis, mobilize against the bipartisan agreement, commitment to increase dangerous military spending, increase provocative actions against China, which could lead to a conflict that nobody wants and could end up into a terminal war. Just have to keep working on this. Nothing else. There are people doing it, plenty, and their efforts have to be expanded, more support, more dedication, no other way to do it.
But time is not on our side.
Doesn't matter. Whatever opportunities they are, we take them. They do exist. We can lament the fact that the stars are not aligned properly, but the only way to do that is by further dedicated engagement and careful thinking about how to structure it and frame it so that it does reach, it prevents the efforts to exploit phrases, terms on the by the Republican, cynical Republican effort to carry out the project they're committed to. Have to ensure not to help that out by bad tactics, by ill-chosen terminology. Recognize that the people being caught up in this are human beings who can be reached and must be reached if we're going to survive.
In the background, of course, is the extreme inequality of the United States, just off the charts. Why is the US so unequal?
Well, it goes back a long way. But a lot of this has happened just in the last 40 years as part of the neoliberal assault on the general population, in which the Democrats have participated as well, not to the extent of the Republican organization, but the Democrats have also played their role. We've talked about it, go through it again. This has had a major impact. We've discussed it before. I'll mention again that there is a fairly careful estimate of what's called the transfer of wealth from the lower 90% of the population to the top 1%, actually a fraction of them, during the 40 years of this assault. A Rand Corporation study which estimated it at close to $50 trillion. That's a lot. It's not pennies, and it's ongoing. During the pandemic, the measures that were taken to save the economy from collapse did lead to further enrichment of the very few, sort of maintained life for the others, but the Republicans are busy trying to dismantle that part of it, leave only the part that enriches the very few. That's their dedication. As you know, the Republicans have red lines that they've imposed on any potential legislation. And Senator Manchin has added his own red line. Take a look at these. They're very telling. For the Republicans, there are two red lines. One, you cannot touch Trump's tax cut, a tax cut which was a complete scam, was a huge benefit for the very rich and the corporate sector, stabbed everyone else in the back. Can't touch that. That's fixed. Second thing you can't touch is funding the Internal Revenue Service. Can't fund the IRS because its task will be to stop massive tax cheating by the super rich. And we have to permit that to continue. That's a red line for the Republicans. The very rich have to be permitted to cheat and rob as much as possible. Coming over to Senator Manchin, his red line is taken out of the playbook of ExxonMobil. No elimination, only innovation. So like ExxonMobil, he's dedicated to dealing with the climate crisis, but with no elimination of fossil fuels, only putting money into inventing something which may or may not come to exist someday, which will remove from the atmosphere the poisons that we have to keep pouring in. That's another red line. Of course, the Republicans agree 100%. Manchin, a couple of others among the Democrats go along with them. So that means let's move as quickly as possible to destroy the environment for the benefit of the few in the fossil fuel industry, so they can make as much profit as possible before we all go under. And the banks that fund them, and the other parts of and the military, which is pouring pollution into the atmosphere at the level of maybe 150 or so middle-income countries, has got to continue with this, because nothing is more important than the profits of the very few and the very rich. Those are the red lines. And they show up in other ways as well. So take what goes on quietly in the background. Take ALEC, American Legislative Exchange Council. This goes back years. Organization funded by almost the entire corporate sector, which is dedicated to hit at the weak point in the constitutional system, the states. It's very easy, doesn't take much to buy or impel a legislative representative at the state level to follow legislation you're writing? Not a lot. So what ALEC has been doing is working at the state level to impose legislation which will foster the long-term efforts of those who are seeking to destroy democracy, to increase radical inequality, to destroy the environment. Let's act at the state level to establish legislation which will implement their efforts, foster and advance their efforts. And one of the most important is get the states to legislate, not to even investigate, certainly not to punish wage theft. Wage theft is a business practice which steals billions of dollars from workers every year by refusing to pay overtime, by other devices. There have been efforts to investigate it, but the business sector wants to stop them. ALEC is getting the states to pass legislation not to punish it and not even to investigate it. That's the state level analog of ensuring that the IRS not go after wealthy corporate tax cheats. At every level you can think of, this class war is raging with intensity on the part of the masters, the corporate sector, the super rich, and they're going to use every means they can to ensure that it goes on as long as possible until they've succeeded in destroying not only American democracy, but the possibility for survival of organized society. That's what's going on before our eyes.
Why, despite their minuscule numbers, are the rich able to dominate?
It's a question that goes back to the first major modern work on political science 350 years ago by David Hume, great philosopher. He wrote his first principles of government, and it opens the first paragraph by raising exactly your question. He says he's mystified by the easiness with which the governed are able to maintain control. The governors are able to maintain control over the governed. The governed, the mass of the population, they have the power if they use it, but they submit to the domination of a small number of rulers. And how can this miracle be accomplished, he asks, 350 years ago? He says, the only answer is consent. The governed, the mass of the population, hand themselves over to the rulers and say, we'll be pliable, we'll be in your hands. We won't arouse problems. You can rule and govern us. That's the answer to the miracle. And there's plenty of evidence to support it. We see it right now. It's very concrete. Take the bill that Congress is now seeking to destroy, the limited Build Back Better bill that the Biden administration advanced. Actually started with Bernie Sanders, was sharply cut back by Congress, cut back even more by the Republicans and the right-wing Democrats. Now it's a shadow which probably won't pass. If you take a look at it closely, it's quite interesting. The measures that are in it are strongly supported by the population. So if you take it measure by measure and you carry out polling, very strong support. Then you ask the population in polls, do you favor the bill? No, we don't favor the bill because the bill is going to harm us. Then a third question. Do you know what's in the bill? No. Okay. That's the way you get the population to consent to subordinate themselves to the masters. There is legislation which they approve of strongly, point by point, but make sure they don't know about it and they think the collection of bills is going to harm them, but in ignorance of what's there. Well, this is a substantially effective device. This is one example that happens to be in the newspapers day by day right now, but it's been going on for hundreds of years in various ways of control, ideological control, manipulation, domination, often violence if it's necessary, which manages to ensure that this miracle that David Hume noticed, it persists. Not entirely. There are periods when the governed recognize that they do have the force and begin to exercise it and change things, because the system of power is in fact very fragile, can collapse very quickly. And we've seen that happen. So for example, if I go back to my childhood, 1930s, deep depression, very serious crisis, but there were actions being taken to counter it. The labor movement had been virtually crushed in the 1920s, mostly by Woodrow Wilson and his Red Scare, final blow to the labor movement. Began to reconstitute. CIO was organizing, militant actions, there were political groups functioning, fairly sympathetic president, managed to get through important legislation. There was so much popular support that the business world had to back off. Large parts of it hated the New Deal, not all of it, but large parts. They backed off because they were going to lose everything if this continued. The courts backed off. The reactionary courts, much like today, had been blocking every measure that the New Deal put forth. Well, by the time the CIO labor activism was leading up to sit-down strikes, the courts backed off. They didn't end the struggle, but they let some things happen because they didn't want it to go too far, just like the business world didn't. And major accomplishments were made. The New Deal accomplishments were very significant. They lasted pretty much up through the 1970s. By that time, the business counteroffensive had reached a point where it could significantly reverse them, as has been happening for the last 40 years, with the Democrats cooperating in the background. But that's the way class struggle proceeds. The governed, the general population, do not have to abdicate their role and be pawns in the hands of the masters, who relentlessly carry out a bitter class struggle using every means available, including those I've mentioned and innumerable others. So that's the choice. And the choice right now happens to be one, as you mentioned at the outset, of unique significance. Human species has never faced a moment like this. And we have faced moments when democracy was collapsing. 1930s was one in Europe where it did collapse, moved to fascism, while the US moved to social democracy. Now it's kind of reversing. We have never had moments when the destruction of organized human society was a likely prospect and not in the long-term distance. That's new. And if that isn't dealt with, nothing else matters.
Corporate power seems unstoppable The Uber class of gazillionaires, Bezos, Branson, and Musk, are flying into outer space. But I'm reminded of something that the novelist Ursula Le Guin said some years ago. She said, "We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable." And then she adds, "So did the divine right of kings."
So was slavery. So was the principle that women are property, formally lasted in the United States until the 1970s. So were laws against miscegenation so extreme that the Nazis wouldn't accept them, lasted in the United States till the 1960s. So was vicious, murderous slavery. All kind of horrors existed. Over time, their power has been eroded. It's never completely disappeared. So slavery was abolished, but its remnants remain in new and vicious forms. It's not slavery, but it's horrifying enough. The idea that women are not persons has been formally overcome and overcome in practice to a substantial extent, but there's plenty to do. The constitutional system was a step forward in the 18th century. Even the phrase, "we the people," terrified the autocratic rulers of Europe. Metternich, the Tsar, who deeply concerned that the evils of democracy, what was called republicanism then, could spread and undermine civilized life. Deeply concerned about that. Well, did spread, and civilized life continued, even improved. So, yes, there are periods of regression, there's progress. The class war never ends. The masters never relent, always looking for every opportunity. If they're the only participants, we will have regression. But they don't have to be any more than in the past, as in the quote that you, eloquent quote that you just gave.
In your Masters of Mankind essay, "Can Civilization Survive Really Existing Capitalism?" you write, "Really existing capitalist democracy, RECD for short, pronounced wrecked, is radically incompatible with democracy. It seems to me," you're writing, "it seems to me unlikely that civilization can survive really existing capitalism and the sharply attenuated democracy that goes along with it. Could functioning democracy make a difference, you ask? Consideration of non-existent systems can only be speculative, but I think there's some reason to think so. Tell me your reasons."
Well, first of all, we live in this world, not in some world we'd like to imagine. And in this world, if you simply think about time scales, the time scale for dealing with environmental destruction is far shorter than the time that would be necessary to carry out significant reshaping of basic institutions. That doesn't mean it doesn't mean you have to abandon the attempt to do that. In fact, you should be doing it all the time. Should be working on ways to raise consciousness, raise understanding, build the rudiments of future institutions in the present society. All of that is an ongoing campaign. At the same time, the measures to save us from self-destruction will have to take place within the basic framework of existing institutions, some modification of them, but without fundamental change. And it can be done. We know how it can be done. There are careful, credible studies, one of the best by my co-author, economist Robert Pollin, great detail, another by Jeffrey Sachs, fine economist using other models, others by the International Energy Agency, which has its roots in corporate America, all pretty much the same. There's a resolution in Congress recently reinitiated by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ed Markey, laying out in extensive detail programs of essentially the same sort. They can be implemented easily within the range of expenditures that are easily tolerable by the economy, by the general economy, perfectly feasible, can be carried out within existing institutions. The task is to make sure that's done. Meanwhile, work on overcoming the problem of wrecked, really existing capitalist democracy, which in its basic nature is a death sentence and also deeply inhuman in its fundamental properties. So let's work on that and at the same time ensure that we save the possibility of achieving it by overcoming the immediate and urgent crisis as can be done within basically the framework of existing institutions. Those are the dilemmas that we face.
Well, you and I are, and others are often accused of just talking about gloom and doom. But here are a couple of items that are quite upbeat and positive. The first one being what happened in India, where thousands of Indian farmers from Punjab and neighboring states encamped outside of Delhi, and after a year-long struggle, forced the Narendra Modi BJP Hindu nationalist regime to roll back 3 agricultural laws which would have reduced farmers to a semi-serf status. Exposed to the elements, people were sleeping outside. Hundreds of farmers died in the protest. Vijay Prashad called these proposed laws the Uberization of farmers, turning them into gig workers. Modi may at some point try and repackage the laws and reintroduce them, but for now, it's a victory of some sort. The other upbeat piece of news is Honduras and the election of Xiomara Castro as president, the first woman to hold that post. She replaces a corrupt right-wing regime that had ruled for 12 years. She's described as a democratic socialist. She's the wife of Manuel Zelaya. He was president, but was overthrown in a coup in 2009. A coup, by the way, correct me if I'm mistaken, that was backed by Washington. Honduras is one of the biggest sources of migration to the United States. Its economy depends on money sent home by its citizens working in the US. Remittances make up roughly 20% of the country's GDP. So talk about those 2 examples.
Can I add a third one? I think yesterday, Lula announced his presidency campaign for Brazil, which he's running way above Bolsonaro in the polls, could lead to a reversal of the move towards proto-fascism in the second largest country in the hemisphere. These 2 things that you mentioned are major victories. The farmer strike in India was an astonishing development. These are farmers who have suffered severely through the neoliberal period. The support systems for the rural agriculture have been undermined. Rural development programs, research programs, the system has been redesigned so that farming life is so painful and difficult that suicides have been rising sharply as farmers just give up hope. The numbers are appalling. This has been going on for years, ever since the neoliberal rules were imposed. The farmers finally rose up with the latest effort of the Modi government to really, as Vijay Prashad said, to basically turn them into barely surviving serfs. They rose up, huge numbers, massive strike, withstood violence and repression, couldn't be beaten down, stayed there persistent over a year, finally won. The government backed down. Very right-wing government, has a lot of voting support, but it had to back down in the face of this massive, that's of extreme importance. It's deeply encouraging. Shows what the people can do when they refuse to be servants of the masters. Honduras has a hideous history. Way back, it's the prototypical so-called banana republic, run by a dozen or so rich families, horrifying export model, awful conditions for most of the population. During the 1980s, it was the US base, military base for the Reagan's terrorist wars in Central America, plenty of repression in Honduras as well. Finally, a moderately reformist candidate appeared, Mills Olaya, a conservative from the conservative movement, but had some moderately reformist efforts. The ruling class came down on him like a ton of bricks. He was forced out of office, expelled from the country, bitterly condemned, harshly condemned by almost all of Latin America, most of the world, with the exception of Obama and Clinton, who gave it a kind of a light tap on the wrist, but refused to call it a military coup, which it obviously was, because if they'd called it a military coup, they would have had to withdraw US military support for the ruling junta, which was destroying Honduran democracy. And they didn't want to do that, so it wasn't a coup. And that, as you said, led to a real increase, sharp increase in the Honduran horror story. It became basically the murder capital of the world. It was the sort people began to flee in desperation. It was the source of the caravans that the US government tried to block or to get other countries to block so they wouldn't reach our border. And they have been the plurality of people fleeing from Central America. What Trump in his recent pronouncement called the criminals who the Democrats are mobilizing to attack the white race and destroy it. Well, that's Honduras. The ruling junta did then carry out an election, which was ridiculed virtually everywhere except in Washington, where Obama and Clinton praised the military junta for their promising steps towards democracy. Then turned, apart from all the other crimes, turned into one of the major narco trafficking centers. The Colombian cartels were using it to ship drugs to the Mexican cartels and into the United States. The president's brother was deeply implicated in this, and the president himself was surely involved.
That was Hernandez, right?
What?
That was The president's name was Hernandez.
Yeah, he's the president who was just replaced. That's Honduras under our rule, actually, for a century, but this is the recent horrifying period. Now, as you say, population did manage to elect Elias with a wife, who might be able to carry out the mild reforms that he was beginning to initiate. There'll be plenty of roadblocks, the same internal forces that overthrew him and drove him into exile, the same US forces which have backed them and have done it for a long time, increasingly in the way I described in recent years. And it's up to us to ensure that that's not overturned. It could be, there's going to be a battle. Similar ones are taking place elsewhere, Peru, Colombia, Brazil, all the areas that are our so-called backyard, Haiti, similarly. In all of these countries, we have an overwhelming influence. It's been used mainly, even overwhelmingly, for harm and destruction. That doesn't have to be. That's our choice here. We can change that. Lost your voice, you're muted.
I would add Chile to that list of countries you just named. Now, when the president says America is back, what does that mean? I can hear late night comics saying it means duck, look out, run for cover.
Well, what Biden meant by the phrase was he was addressing Europe, and he said, well, Trump, who was the only thing he understood was how to wreck, how to serve the rich and how to wreck. Those are his policies. So one of the things he wrecked was European alliances. And Bush was saying, don't worry, we're going to rejoin you in the alliances of the past, which don't have a very lovely record, I should say, but we're going to rejoin you in those. So he's saying we are going to rejoin the Paris agreements that Trump pulled out of. We're going to, he claimed that they would make some moves to renew the Iran nuclear agreement that Trump had destroyed, a few other measures, but basically policy didn't change very much. It's some of the more gratuitously sadistic elements of Trump's policies, which had no geopolitical significance, were reversed, but the fundamental policies remain, and in some ways are becoming even harsher. So take, say, the Ukraine. The far right Fox News commentator Tucker Carlson made the comment that should be the leading element of policy. Whatever you think about Putin, maybe the rottenest person in the world, he's not trying to conquer Europe. He's not even trying to conquer Ukraine. He's trying to protect Russian borders from what is, from the Russian point of view, a very serious threat. That's Tucker Carlson, and he's correct. Meanwhile, the Biden administration is sending hawks like Victoria Nuland to try to increase the tensions and raise the possibility, they're not trying to do this, but that's the consequence, to raise the possibility of a confrontation that can be settled by diplomacy and negotiations. They're raising it, as in the case of China, to the level that might lead to a very serious conflict, even terminal war. And we have to turn to Tucker Carlson for sanity on the topic. That's a serious, I don't know what his motives are, whatever they are. The comment was the right one. And the fact that that's coming from the extreme right is a terrible condemnation of our political system. Should be coming from the sane, liberal center, obviously from the left.
But staying on China, Noam, for a moment, much of the mainstream media, not just Tucker Carlson, Fox, is awash in reports about what is called the China threat. Recently, you were on Pakistan's Danish TV, and you said, China is not subordinate to the United States. It cannot be intimidated by the United States. It's not like Europe, and that's unacceptable. If you're the global dominant hegemon, the mafia don, basically, you can't accept successful defiance. China is not like Europe, you say. Can Europe be pushed around? Is that what you mean?
We see it every moment. Take the phrase successful defiance. That comes from the State Department in the 1960s, Kennedy Johnson years. They were talking about Cuba and the Cuban threat. Said the threat of Cuba is Cuba's successful defiance of US policies going back 150 years. That means to the 1820s, going back to the Monroe Doctrine, which announced Washington's intention to dominate the hemisphere. It was just words at the time. Britain was far too powerful for the US to dominate the hemisphere. But that was the goal. And Cuba today, 1960s, is successfully defying our goal, which by, of course, that time the United States had succeeded in achieving, as the founders anticipated and said. Britain would decline, the US would increase in power. Sooner or later, John Quincy Adams put it, Cuba would fall into our hands by the laws of political gravitation, the way an apple falls from the tree, and we would extend our domination over the hemisphere. Well, that happened by 1960. Cuba was beginning to defy it, and that successful defiance cannot be tolerated. The United States launched major terrorist wars, which we don't talk about here, but they were very serious. They almost led to a terminal nuclear war, a blockade, severe blockade, country that's small island in the shadow of the United States can barely survive this. It's amazing they survived. Now let's go to Europe and being pushed around. Europe strongly opposes this, as the entire world does. We see that every year at the United Nations, when the General Assembly has a vote on the US embargo of Cuba, the US sanctions and blockade of Cuba. It's almost, this last year was unanimous, 180 to 2 against the United States. 2 are the United States and Israel, client state, which votes reflexively with the master. All of Europe strongly opposes it, but they abide by it. They keep to it. Same with Iran. Europe strongly opposed Trump's demolition of the joint agreement in violation of Security Council orders, if anyone cares. Trump pulled out, said, too bad, it's done. Then imposed harsh sanctions on Iran to punish Iran for our destruction of the agreement, which they had been living up to. Well, that passed here without comment, not in Europe. Europe bitterly condemned it. In fact, said they were going to find ways to avoid the US sanctions, which they sharply condemned. they then abided by them. They abide by the US sanctions. They're pushed around again. And this continues. Of course, they have reasons. If you defy the master, the godfather, you get punished. The United States has weapons. One of them is straightforward. You're thrown out of the international financial system, which is run from New York. Well, not a small thing. Afghanistan right now, a million Afghans are facing starvation. Well, the United States withholds the funds from the government, which happen to be sequestered in New York banks, and pressured, according to the press reports, has been pressuring the international institutions to withhold support from them, while Afghans die of starvation. Well, that's, I hate to use the word, but that's a small scale example of the fact that you can't tolerate successful defiance. There are many others. In the island of Grenada, the nutmeg capital of the world, very powerful force. Can't find it on a map. They had a reformist leader, Maurice Bishop, in the 1970s, who began to carry out very mild reforms, starting a fishing cooperative, a couple more things. Carter administration came down on them quickly, launching efforts to isolate them, to get them to stop this defiance of US power. Later, Reagan invaded with a grand show of courage and manliness, stood up proudly announcing, the United States stands up strong. 6,000 US special forces were able to overcome the resistance of 40 Cuban construction workers who had already agreed to allow the Americans to enter, but the Reagan administration pretended it hadn't heard that, so it could send in a show of force. 6,000 Rangers, special forces, got, I think, 8,000 medals of honor for their great courage, and Reagan projected himself as a major hero strutting around to show America's great again. Probably this was undertaken to try to drive off the front pages the fact that an attack in Lebanon at an American base had killed a couple hundred American Marines, and that didn't look good. So let's invade Grenada and show how powerful and manly we are. So, well, that's Grenada. No successful defiance. You get to China, can't do it. Not intimidated, continue their programs. Actually, when I said that about the China threat, I was actually quoting a highly regarded international statesman, former Prime Minister of Australia, right facing the dragon in its claws. He published an article in which he analyzed the China threat, debunked every part of it, which is not very difficult, ended up by concluding the China threat is that China exists. It exists. It's not intimidated, continues its programs. It's even doing really dangerous things. Like, for example, recently it established plans for creating, I think, 1,000 vocational schools in Southeast Asia, Thailand, Africa, where students will be taught Chinese technology, which means that their countries will then be using advanced Chinese technology. The United States is working very hard to prevent China's technological development and to prevent countries from using Chinese technology, all sorts of efforts for that. And here China is going around us, setting up vocational schools where students will be trained in advanced technology, improving their own countries, and indebted to China for doing it. How can a country sink to that level of barbarism? We really have to work hard to prevent it. And the only answers we seem to have are bombs. Somehow, doesn't seem like an effective weapon. So there's a real China threat. Plenty of things that China's doing are quite wrong, even abominable, merit severe condemnation, some even in violation of international law, but none of them are a threat. Those are not a threat, and those even don't concern the United States. The United States tolerates much worse behavior elsewhere. The China threat is exactly what Paul Keating said. Its existence as a rock that you can't move, and is going to continue with its policies. It's expanding its programs through Central Asia, incorporating the region within a China-dominated system. Shanghai Cooperation Organization, based in China, includes Russia, which has rich resources and a strong military system, includes India, Pakistan, Iran is now a member, all the Central Asian states. Very likely going to include Afghanistan pretty soon. China will begin to exploit Afghanistan's rich mineral resources, try to shift its economy from opium production, which is what it's been under the American rule, to mineral export. Maybe they'll succeed in this, maybe not. Their eye is plainly on Turkey. Turkey's going bankrupt. China will presumably move to expand its already substantial influence in Turkey, move on to extend its influence to Eastern, Central Europe, development programs in Africa, even encroaching in South America, US domains. US has been unable to do anything to stop it. It's tried, but about all we're doing is increasing provocation in the seas around China, where China is doing things that are totally improper, but then can be dealt with by diplomacy and negotiations, much as in the Ukraine case. But it's not going to be done under the hawkish national security advisors of the Biden administration. That's another thing that has to be changed, and fast.
Another 10 minutes, Noam, okay?
Yeah, but I have another talk coming up, so.
Okay, 10 more minutes, that's it. We'll talk about the importance of independent media from the progressive point of view. Democracy Now!, fairness and accuracy in reporting, may I say alternative radio, publishers like Verso and Haymarket and the New Press, magazines like The Nation and In These Times, online magazines like The Intercept. How important are they in countering the dominant corporate narrative?
What else is going to counter it? They're the ones who are holding up the hope that we'll be able to find ways to counter these highly harmful, destructive developments that we're discussing. As I mentioned before, the core method, which we both know, is education. People have to come to understand. They can't do that if there aren't means of disseminate information and analysis, opening up opportunities for discussion, which you're not going to find very much, maybe occasionally at the margins, but you'll barely find them in the mainstream. including a lot of what we've been talking about, which is not discussed at all or so marginally within the major media. So they have to be brought to the public this way. There is no other way. Actually, there is another way. Organization. Inside organizations, it is possible and in fact easy to conduct educational and cultural programs. That was one of the major contributions of the labor movement when it was a vibrant, lively institution. One of the main reasons why Reagan and Thatcher were so determined to destroy the labor movement, as they both did. Their first moves were attacks on the labor movement. They were educational and cultural programs which brought people together to think about the world, to understand it, to develop ideas. Takes organization and interaction to do that. To do that alone and as an isolated person is extremely difficult, if possible at all. So organization is a powerful means. Independent media integrate with organizational efforts. I should say, as late as the 1950s, despite the corporate effort to beat back the unions, late as the 1950s, there was a lively, independent labor press in the United States, reaching lots of people, condemning what they called the bought priesthood of the mainstream press. That took a long time to destroy that. That can be revived. There's a long history in the United States of a vibrant, progressive labor press back to the 19th century when it was a major phenomenon. That can be revived, should be revived as part of the revival of a militant, functioning labor movement at the forefront of progress towards social justice. Happened before, can happen again. And an independent media are critical elements of this. When I was a kid in the 1930s, early 40s, I could read Izzy Stone in the Philadelphia Record. It wasn't the major journal in Philadelphia. It was a small journal on the side, but it was there. Later, I could read him in the late 40s in PM, which was an independent newspaper in the late 40s. Made a huge difference, not just Izzy Stone, but others like him. Later in the 50s and 60s, the only way to read him was in his own personal newsletter. That was the independent media in the 50s. 60s began to pick up a little bit with ramparts. They sort of pretty much went out of, and radio stations like Danny Schechter's WBCN in Boston, others like it here and there. Well, this continues around the country. And the ones you mentioned are major ones. These are the forces for independence, for thinking. Made a huge difference for me when I was growing up to hear these things, read them. And the same is true for others today.
Two more questions very quickly. There are multiple mentions of Antonio Gramsci in two of your most recent books, Consequences of Capitalism and Climate Crisis and the Global Green New Deal. Specifically, the crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. Now, we've talked about that one. The other one, which I'd like you to address, is pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. Talk about Gramsci and his relevance today and the meaning of that quote.
Well, let's talk about Gramsci first. Gramsci was a leading left labor activist, very active in, he was Italian, in around the early 20s, the late teens of the last century, organizing left worker collectives, self-directed, kind of the left part, the left wing of the international communist Marxist system, the left wing of it. In Italy, the fascist government took over early 20s. One of their first acts was to send Gramsci to prison. The reasons were given by the prosecutor. The prosecutor stated during the trial, we have to silence this voice. Gets back to the independent media. We have to silence this voice. So he was sent to prison. Well, he wrote prison notebooks. He wasn't silenced, though the public couldn't read him. And there he continued the work that he began, including some of the things you quoted. Yes, he said in the early 30s, the old world is collapsing, the new world has not yet risen. We are facing morbid symptoms. Mussolini was one, Hitler was another, almost conquered permanently large parts of the world. We came very close to that. The Russians defeated Hitler, otherwise half the world would be run by Nazi Germany. But it was very close. And there were morbid symptoms were clear everywhere. Well, the slogan that he made famous wasn't his, but he made in his journals when he was still able to publish, was what you quoted: pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. We have to look at the world reasonably, without illusions, understand it, decide how to act, but and recognize that there are grim portents. There are very dangerous things happening. That's pessimism of the intellect. At the same time, we recognize there are ways out. There are opportunities. There are the kinds of achievements that you mentioned before, many more ways of dealing with the crises we face. So we have optimism of the will, meaning we dedicate ourselves to using all the opportunities that are available, and they do exist, and moving on to overcome the morbid symptoms and move towards a more just and decent world. And I'm afraid I have to.
Yes, one last, this is it. This is the last question. In these dark times, it's difficult for many to feel there's a bright future ahead. You're always asked, what gives you hope? And I have to ask you the same question that so many others do.
Same thing we've talked about before. One thing that gives hope is that people are struggling hard under very severe circumstances, much more severe than we can imagine, struggling hard to achieve rights and justice. They don't give up hope, like the farmers in India, or the people living in misery in Honduras. They don't give up. So we certainly can't. The other is that there's simply no option. The alternative to giving up hope is to say, okay, I'll help the worst to happen. That's the choice. You can say, I'll refuse to engage in the opportunities that are available. I'll help ensure that the worst will happen as quickly as possible. It's one choice. The other is, I'll try to do as best I can what the farmers in India are doing, what poor miserable peasants in Honduras are doing, many others like them throughout the world. I'll do that as best I can, and maybe we can get to a decent world in which people can feel that they can live without shame, a better world. So that's not much of a choice. We can easily make it.
You turned 93 on December 7th. On behalf of Alternative Radio and many people all over the world, a belated happy birthday, Noam Chomsky.
Thank you very much. And
Take care.
I have to go off to the next.
All right. Thanks a lot. Talk to you soon. Love you.
Thank you.